So it's very good to see so many people coming, and it really reinforces what the Education Committee and Ritual Committee who worked together on this program were feeling, which is there is a great hunger and a great thirst, not just for Judaism and Jewish learning, but for bringing it together, for making sense of all of the different pieces that we have seen. And that's really what we are going into. Now, most of you, if I had to guess, did much of your Jewish learning, much of your Jewish education when you were knee-high to the rabbi, when you were in your younger years, whether it be from the years before your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, or whether it be through your teen years, maybe through your college years, but quite likely a lot of your education really happened in those early years. And most of us think that that's the best time to learn. Most of us think, because that's when we did our learning, that that's when it's best. But the truth of the matter is that that isn't how it works. Children learn from the bottom up. Children learn in a cumulative method. They learn one thing, and then having mastered that, they can add another thing on top. But if they don't master that first point, they can't go any higher until they can. Adults, on the other hand, we can start with the Keter. We can start with the crown. And that's going to be our first topic tonight, of what do we mean when we talk about the crown. Adults can learn from the top down. Unfortunately, most of us as adults continue to learn as we did as a child. We continue to learn only by the bits and pieces that are given to us, and we can look for just stacking little things, making little piles on top of itself. But we need to get up in the air, we need to see things from a bird's eye point of view, and we need to see how it all fits together. Now, you probably, because of you have learned at many different times in your life, you probably already know a lot of stuff. And it looks like this in your brain. Right? You know there's this thing called God. You know that there's such a thing as a bat mitzvah, Israel, Miriam, some names here, some dates, some numbers. You've got a big jumble of Judaism in your brain. And that's great. That's probably why you came into this room tonight rather than sitting home watching TV. But the problem is, this isn't Judaism. This is Jewish knowledge. And we need to transform Jewish knowledge into Judaism. So what do you need to know Judaism? Well, you need to know how to live every moment of every day in harmony with the infinite greatness of God, as reflected through the mysteries of the universe, which is ever increasing in its beauty and complexity. It's just that easy. Right? Sounds maybe a little intimidating, and the stack of books is meant to look intimidating, because that's usually what we think this equals. We think that this means we have to master this before we can do that. And that's back to front. That's thinking of it the way that a child learns. Right? When a child wants to learn how to be an engineer, you start them off with 1 + 1. And that equals 2. And that's good for a child because a child cannot see the broad picture. But you can see this, and everyone can understand this sentence, right? My English is fairly clear? Yes? Does anyone not understand what that sentence means? Good. You now know what Judaism asks of you. And you now know what the basic framework is for every piece of Jewish knowledge you learn, where it fits. It fits into this. This is what we are trying to achieve. The act of living in harmony with the infinite greatness of God in this world, in all of its beauty and complexity. Now, I'm not going to kid you. The details are hard. But don't panic. Because every line of every book and every word of every sermon and every insight of each day is a reflection of a few simple principles which reinforce that statement we just saw. And we are going to explore those principles together over the next series of weeks in these courses. In-depth learning adds detail and nuance. But in-depth learning, which is what most of us find intimidating, that hangs off these core ideas. Now, many of you, I'm sure, because you learned Judaism usually beginning as a child, never learned the core principles of Judaism. You learned all the bits and details. You learned all that Jewish knowledge, that mishmash spinning around in your brain. Well, we're going to fix that. We're going to work on the core principles so you'll understand how all of that you already know and everything that you're going to learn forever and ever in the rest of your life will fit together into Judaism rather than just that chaos of a brain. So Ben Bagbag, famous rabbi from the Mishnah time, said, "Turn the Torah over and over, for everything is in it. Look into it, grow old and worn over it, and never move away from it, for you will find no better portion than it." Ben Bagbag was trying to remind us that it's not that hard. Yes, there's a huge stack of books which can help us find new things, new insights, but the essential essence of all that there is to be Jewish is contained in the very short book called the Torah. I know you probably don't think the Torah is very long. The Torah is a pamphlet compared to a modern novel. If you have read the Harry Potter series, for example, or if you've read any Clive Cussler or any of those massive tomes that are out there, you have read books that are multiple times longer than the entire Bible, let alone the Torah. It is from simple seeds that we learn. And Ben Hehe, who goes down in history as having the greatest rabbi name ever, he used to say that according to the effort is the reward. So one last little reminder, if you don't think you're going to be able to learn everything, don't worry. Try to learn. That is how we measure our success. Because no one is going to be able to learn everything about the greatness of God and the infinite complexity of the universe. But everyone can try. All right. So right now, your learning is like loose gems. What you've already learned is a sack of diamonds. It's precious, but disconnected. This is what we're turning it into. All right, we're going to take what you already know and add new things to make that setting, and you will see how Judaism fits and how life fits together in patterns. All right, this is for sale in the gift store. Were you just asking that? In Judaism, we often call the Torah the tree of life. We call it the Eitz Chaim, because each act, each moment in life is like a tiny leaf on that tree of life. And each moment, each leaf is connected to a thin branch. And then each branch comes together to form part of a bough. And then, or bow. Bough. When the bough breaks, thank you. Comes together to form part of a bough. And then each of those boughs come together to unify into the trunk. But many of us don't get to that trunk, which is why we're starting here with the tree of life as conceived by the Kabbalists. And we will use these principles. Now, you'll find on the back of the handouts a whole set of the different courses that we will be covering, the different main values and principles that are going to be covered. These are taken in title form from the tree of life, of the Sfirot of Kabbalah. We are not going to be examining this from the Kabbalistic perspective. Right? If you're looking for a multi-week course on Kabbalah, this is the wrong course. But if you're looking for a course that recognizes what Kabbalah recognized, that there are core principles that reflect the emanations of God and life and the intersection of both in our world, then you shouldn't be surprised by some of the titles that we have. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with one. Keter. This is the first of our principles that we're going to examine. Keter literally means crown. And Keter is focusing on the crown of Judaism. It is focusing on the most essential, primordial, and perfect expression of what Judaism tries to teach us and which all other principles hang off of. And it's a very simple sentence. God is one. Sound familiar? Good. But have you thought about what it actually means? First of all, it means God exists. But that, sorry Monty Python, that is not God. That is not God. That is not God. I know that many of us see God reflected in the glory of nature, but it isn't God. Even when we try to reflect on the beautiful energy of the universe, it's still not God. And even George Burns, close but no cigar, isn't God. Great movie, by the way, but not God. God isn't a body. And by a body, I don't mean God isn't a person. I mean God has no physical presence in all of reality. God is not comprised of atoms and molecules and electrons and all those other wonderful things that everything else in the universe is made up of. God is not energy. Many of us substitute the immaterialism of God with a visualization of God as our free-floating energy of the universe, as some form of power or spirit, we call it. But what we really think we're saying, or what we really feel we're saying, is that it's a type of energy. God is not. God is not an electron. God is not force. God is not gravity. God is not energy. God is not an emotion. You'll often see bumper stickers or aphorisms on Facebook that will say things like, God is love. God is kindness. No, God isn't. God is not limited to an emotion. When we feel love, as we'll talk about later, yes, we draw closer to God, but we should never substitute the emotion for God. God is not contained within our hearts. I know that may be a little shocking because we've used that aphorism so often as a cliche to make ourselves feel close to God. And the heart can be a portal to God. But God isn't there. And if we limit God to that, we are going to have great difficulty understanding how everything else fits together. God is not the totality of the universe. This is known as pantheism, and it was advocated by Spinoza during the few hundred years ago, and he got him into a lot of trouble. The Christian church forced us to excommunicate him for saying this. But the main problem with this was not that it was heresy or that it was going to get people in trouble. The main problem with this is God is not of this universe. God is not made up of the bits of this universe. All right, so let's pause there for a quick second and make sure we understand how we've gotten to this point and where we are. Questions? Comments? Anyone want to storm out of here because I said God wasn't love? We're doing okay? Bernie.
So the spirituality that I feel like emanates from within me is a connection to God. But I know that spirituality is not God. It's just my expression to the concept of God.
Excellently put. The spirituality that we feel at different times in greater or lesser degrees that emanates from within us and from our experiences, from our relationships, from all the things that we do, is a connection to God. But it isn't God. It's akin if you were to be watching TV, trying to explain to someone that the vision of what you have there is real, but it's not the real. That in fact there is some other force that is making it present and accessible to you, but the real is somewhere completely far away that you can't see, touch, or hear. Well, imagine explaining that to someone who's never really understood what a TV is. Looks real. I can walk up and touch it. But it isn't the actual thing. The vision of the actor isn't the actor. The sound that comes out is not the sound that was generated by the actors. And in fact, it may not even be happening at the time that you're watching it. We have more difficulty when we come to God because we want God to feel close to us. And God is close to us. But God is not close to us in the traditional definitions of close. God is not close to us in the sense that God is inside of us. God is not close to us in the sense that God is next to us. God is close to us in the sense that God transcends all of the universe, so every point in the universe isn't far from God. Because God isn't in any one point of the universe. I know that may be hard to wrap our head around. And that's because we lack the ability to totally comprehend something so utterly different from our reality and experiences. Get used to that idea. When we try to pigeonhole God into something that we can define or explain, let alone something that works as a good kitschy expression on a tweet or a bumper sticker or a pamphlet that someone's knocking at the door handing to you, we are ruining God. We are cheapening God. It is akin, as the prophet said, to the people in the ancient world who thought they could lock God in the box in the Ark of the Covenant, or put God into the temple and trap God there. And as the prophets tried to say, look, if you want to talk metaphorically, the entire world is nothing more than a footstool to me. How dare you think I can fit inside of a box? How dare you think God can fit into your brain? But that doesn't mean we stop thinking or trying to connect to God. The best we can say is that God exists beyond our reality, yet can and does interact with this universe and its inhabitants, that's us, in ways that encourage what we call love and justice. That makes sense? Right? God is an entity that exists in ways that we don't understand, and yet interacts in ways that we also don't fully understand with us, in a way that we do understand, because the application of God's revelation, the application of what God's laws are for the world, results in what we very easily can identify as love and justice. So we are seeing God reflected and reflected and reflected again. And by the time we get to the end, we can point to that ultimate reflection on the ground, bouncing off different mirrors, and say, that I can tell what it is. That's love and that's justice. What that light source is that generated the love and the justice that I'm seeing, that I'm not so sure about, because when I look at it, my eyes hurt. But I can see what happens when it's reflected into this world. Yes? Okay. Question?
I have a question. Are you saying then that in Judaism, God is not a personal God?
Yes and no. So the phrase personal God is tricky. When we say a personal God, many people imagine that God is a person that they can communicate with and connect to and talk to. That they can have a conversation with the same way they would have a conversation with a person, and that God is then like how they are imagining it. Like Tevye, exactly. But the beauty of Judaism, really the beauty of God, is that God says, if that works for you, that's okay. But don't believe that what you imagine when you're having that conversation is the totality of what I am. If that helps you connect to me, to sit and talk, as Tevye did, to God, the way you would talk to a dear friend, or the way you would talk to someone whose sage advice you truly valued, that's fine. But if you think you've got God in your pocket because you can pull him out and talk to him anytime you want, anytime you like, and that's all God is, that's called idolatry. And that's forbidden by Judaism for very good reasons. Not just because it leads to corrupt and painful societies, but because it corrupts the very notion of what God is. That God doesn't fit into our pocket. Other questions? Comments? Okay. Well,
why do we do the Shabbat? Why do we pray to, maybe we're not praying to God?
So why then do we pray? Why then do we engage in mitzvot? Why do we seek God's presence? Why do we want to be connected to God? Those are massive questions that are going to be covered in little bits throughout the entire course. And I'll give you the short answer at the moment. So we seek a connection to God because we know that it transforms us. That is to say, despite the total inability of us to understand all of God, we know that the more we do understand, the closer we can approximate what God has designed for this universe, the better we are and the better our life is. It doesn't mean better in an absolute sense like your stock portfolio is going up. But we do know that life takes on a purpose and a meaning and a quality, a character, that, like God, is not easy to pin down, but is still palpably different than when we reject and move away from God. When we engage in specific acts, hoping that we will be able to harness that connection, to improve our lives or improve the lives of others, it gets much more complicated. And indeed, many people treat a mishaberach as a petition to the government. You know, I'd like the zoning regulation changed. Please hear my plea and get back to me in 6 to 8 weeks. Exactly. And when we connect to God in that mode, we usually get the same kind of answer that we get from the government. When we connect to God in the mode of, God, my loved one is hurting. Please help them and help those who are helping them find a way to get through this. Because I know that in your infinity, there is a way out of this, if only we can find it. That directs us into a path where those solutions can become more apparent. We can't trace it, with a Geiger counter, but it does have an effect on our lives and the lives of those who are going through trouble. So it's not as easy as simply dropping in the request box. It's more complicated than that, but it's still an important aspect of our life, both the reaching out as well as the results that can happen. It's just that can that gets everybody really annoyed. But that's that whole infinite and incomprehensible thing, which God has tried to explain to us more than one occasion in the Bible, and we're still working on it. All right, so God is all of this, and yet, sorry, that's not the right page. Why did it go there? And, sorry, looking for my notes here. I see. All right. And to get to the point that you just made, which you anticipated my next slide, which I thought I already put up there, that in addition to God being all of this, and being infinite and great and beyond our comprehension, and yet reflecting in the world what we can recognize as love and justice, we also know that God has created the universe and instructions in such a way that we can come closer to God through carefully nurturing our spirits, our minds, and our hearts. So this is the more general answer to your question of, if God is so distant and so impossible to understand, why bother? And we bother because it works. We bother because it makes things better. This is one of the hardest things to explain to someone who hasn't had an experience where they can say, yes, at this moment, I felt a tiny, tiny piece of what is God in this world. But it makes life different. You probably have felt it at times when witnessing natural beauty, when witnessing a moving moment within your life, when faced with crisis or disaster. If you have connected to God at one of those moments, when often we are more open and receptive to tuning into that frequency, it makes a difference. God has tried to show us how to do this. But more important for just tonight is to recognize that this is what Judaism is attempting to do for us. That whole jumble of ideas, of facts, are all there in order to guide us to this realization. That God is not the Aristotelian first mover. That God is not some transcendent force that set the universe in motion. But that God is infinitely transcendent, but also infinitely proximate. That God is infinitely close. And he's given us an instruction book on how to make the gap between both being infinitely far and infinitely near. And one of the ways that happens is by telling us, as we saw back in our initial phrase, does everyone remember what is our one phrase? God is one, right? So we've done the God is part. Let's make sure we understand what we mean when we say God is one. Because one is a complicated word. God is only one by definition. God is only one and only one character. And by character, I mean characteristic, his nature. God is the only one source of everything in the universe, and there is only one relationship, only one connection to God. We're going to go through all of these in points, so hold on. By definition, I promise this is going to be the most philosophical we get, and then we're moving on. One, the concept of oneness can mean either a quantity or a quality. For example, if I say, there's one man over here, I am just counting. That is a quantity. I am measuring the number of men in the room. And I come up with the answer, 1. But when I say that, I'm not saying anything about the guy. I'm simply saying about the number of guys in the room. Everyone got that idea? Okay. When we say one God, we are not counting. Right? This is not one potato, two potato, one God, two God, three God. When we say God is one, we are not counting, we are defining. When we say one God, it means there could not logically exist another God any more than a square could have 5 sides. Right? What does it mean for something to be a square? It's got 4 sides. If I take away one side, do I still have a square? No. If I add a side, do I still have a square? No. By definition, it needs to have 4. By definition, God needs to be one. If there were 2 gods, neither of them would be God. It's just as simple as that. It's like saying that a square is round or a triangle has 4 sides. It simply doesn't make logical sense. If God is infinite, if God is this essence that exists beyond our reality, there can't be more than one of those. Because if there were, there would need to be something beyond it. And then that would be the one. How are we doing with this? We want to move past our philosophy. Okay. So, according to Rambam, in his Mishnah Torah, right up at the beginning, before he gets into all of the lovely, juicy details about how we pray and about how we keep kosher and how we do our business and about how we go to war and how we live our lives with our families, before Rambam gets into all of that, the very first chapter of his very first book in his entire halakhic corpus begins with an understanding of God. So, I'm in good company when I organized my talk tonight. And he says, this is Rambam's words, God is not 2 or more entities, but a single entity of a oneness even more single and unique than any single thing in creation. God's oneness is not like that of a single type, which consists of many individuals, right, the one man kind of thing, nor is it like the oneness of the body, which incorporates many parts, right? I have one body, but my one body is actually a totality of lots of little bits. But it is absolutely unique. And there is nothing else in existence with a oneness like God's. That's another part of that whole very, very hard for us to comprehend. Because everything else in existence, when we say one, we're talking numbers. And when we say one about God, we're talking about definition. It's tricky for us to get, but, that's why we say it multiple times each day. Hello? There we go. So by character, we said that God was one by definition. We also said God was one by character. Every human has different impulses and moods, right? When something makes us happy, we smile. When something makes us sad, we cry. When we are angered, we might shout. When we are touched, we might give. By touched here, I mean moved emotionally. Right? Everybody understands this is true about us, right? At different moments, at different times, our moods, our impulses, our feelings, they ebb and they flow, they wax and they wane. And how we behave and how we act comes and goes. And it's not, when I say moods or impulses, I'm not just talking about living in the whim of an emotional roller coaster. It can be our rational choices as well. Today I've decided I want to exercise, and tomorrow I've decided I want to study. It's not necessarily an emotional decision in the classical Western usage of the word, but it's still something that is coming and going depending upon things that change each and every day. Yes? That ain't God. Sometimes we visualize God, and quite often in the language of the Bible, as happy, or angry, or weary, or mighty. And this gives us terms that are familiar to hold on to. But God's true character is indivisible. Right? God doesn't get angry. Everyone okay with that? God doesn't get upset. God doesn't change God's mind. God doesn't love somebody one minute and then not love them the next. That's not how God works. Because to work like that would open up God to being not infinitely one. Because the God of today would be different than the God of yesterday. And that means God ain't infinite. Because infinite means unchanging. God doesn't have mood swings. God can't have mood swings. Every time in Judaism where we say God gives the law and does not change, God speaks and God fulfills, what we are saying is exactly that. God's word is God's action. Because unlike us humans, who say things and often don't do them, or do the opposite, for God to want to do something is for it to happen. God's will is action. It's not separate. Because again, dividing it would be dividing God. Doing okay? Maybe? Yeah? This one's hard. Okay? Because the language of the Tanakh is full of metaphor and illustrations that seem to contradict this. Right? It says, and God was angry with the children of Israel. Right? And God remembered Sarah. Right? And God took pity upon them when they cried out to him. Right? That language is everywhere in the Tanakh. I'm assuming that as I saw the hands start going down as I said that, that was kind of the main question that was about to crop up. Right? It also says in the Torah that God's nostrils flare. It also says in the Torah that God reaches out with an outstretched arm. It also says that God carries us on eagle's wings. It says that God sees us, or that God heard us. Is there anybody here who believes that God has ears? Is there anybody here who believes that God has wings? Do I have to flip back to the pictures and remind you? No? Does anybody here believe God has a hand? It's a good metaphor. It's a good symbol because I'll tell you right now, looking around at a lot of the faces here, I can see that all this philosophy talk, that doesn't work so well. Right? Which is why the Torah wasn't written in philosophy talk. I tell you, if Aristotle had understood that, he would have had a much better seller. But he did philosophy talk and almost got completely forgotten until the Muslims were able to find some ancient copies. Whereas we wrote what God told us based off the metaphor and allegory and poetry that was meant to inspire us, that was meant to guide us, that was meant to point us in the right direction for our feelings and our actions and our passions. But it wasn't meant to be a substitute for the real things. And our metaphors were not meant to be a prison that God had to fit. Because ultimately, eventually, God is hoping that we will outgrow the metaphor and want the real connection. And want to go past thinking of God as angry. Go past thinking of God as somehow remembering one day as though God hadn't remembered the day before. But those metaphors are useful in the meantime, and they're very useful for also tapping in the warm parts of our spirit that sometimes need the poetry more than the philosophy. Which is why we definitely are not editing anything to take it out. I thought I saw another hand, maybe? Okay, onward. Right, God has no moods, but is always perfectly God. As again, Rambam says, God does not change, for there is nothing that can induce a change in him. God cannot die and does not live as life is known. Right, let that one sink in for a second. Life, biological life, which is what we're all used to as being the only thing that counts as life, God does not have that. There is no pulse, there is no EKG. You can't put God in an MRI. God does not reproduce. God does not consume and excrete, all those things from your biology class that told you about life. God does not have those. Does God exist? Yes. But God's existence and God's living is not equal to our existence and our living. God also has no stupidity or wisdom as we know them. Okay? Wisdom is based upon an increase in our understanding of the universe that changes from one point to the next. God does not change, and God does not need to learn more about the universe that exists only because of God's will. That's kind of the way he designed it. So there is no wisdom to be gained. There is no learning, and of course there is no stupidity. God does not sleep. God does not wake up. God does not experience anger, merriment, joy, sadness, silence, or speech as we know them. That's all metaphor and poetry. Good metaphor and good poetry. And it is beautiful and moving when read and understood in that way. But it can also be an unfortunate trap if you don't move beyond the surface of that. And who here has ever read Robert Frost's Lonely Woods poem? Who here thinks he was just talking about a guy who stopped for a moment with his horse? Exactly. Right? It is a poem about a guy stopping with a horse. But if that was all you got from it, Robert Frost would be very, very upset with you. Because he did not want to write that poem just to tell you about what it's like to stop somewhere with a horse. So too for our Tanakh, so too for our Bible, and so too for everything that God has revealed to us. If you stop only at the surface, you have not done it credit. All right, onward. One source. We said at the beginning that God is one by definition. God has only one character, and God is also the only source for everything that is in existence. All energy, all matter, all life, all people, all might, all glory, all beauty, all wisdom. Everything has only one source. That should be humbling. Because there is no difference in the source between you and the chair that you are sitting on. You come from the same place. There is no difference in the source between you and someone who lives in another country. As far as the great wheel of life goes, you are here. I don't know if you can see from where you are. That says Homo sapiens. And I should point out, that's not even you singular. That's you, the species. You, the singular, wouldn't even be a pixel on this. Right? Everything else that is around it, those are other animals within the great taxonomy of life, which looks like that. You are here, up there under the animals. That's Homo sapiens in the tree of life of all things living on this planet. That's where we occupy. And if you follow the tree all the way back around, you'll notice that everything ultimately comes back to one point. All life on this planet began from the same source. Some of us have changed a little bit from that very early form, some not so much, but all of us have that same source. Me and the bacteria. Me and the elephant. But also me and stars. And everything else in existence are all drawn from that same source. It says in Isaiah that God is forming light and creating darkness, making peace and creating evil. I am Adonai, who does all these things. All right, who's upset by this phrase? Yes, good.
No, I wasn't going to say
No?
upset. I think that's one of the most mature and, the most understanding in the Torah. I read that and it's like, yeah, all the other stuff that was stoning and then doing that. This makes sense.
We stone men too. Just make sure that we're egalitarian in this. There are lots of reasons for stoning men too. Okay. But evil?
I mean, it doesn't seem like primitive. It's not a primitive idea at all.
Well, what's the alternative to this phrase? I am God and I create light, and that entity over there creates darkness. I create peace, and that entity over there creates bad. No, not so much. Now, the problem, of course, is that we jump to the conclusion that evil means what we normally see as being the result of human choice. And it is true that God did create human choice, but God does not force us to choose the paths that we have. So you can't blame God for someone else choosing to do something evil. You can blame God for giving us the choice, but then you also have to blame God for everything else on that list. And most of us aren't comfortable with that, especially because if we go back to our main principle about what we are trying to achieve in all of this, remember, living in harmony every single moment of our day with the infinite greatness of God and the complexity of the universe, then I know with time and with practice and with understanding, that evil can go away. Because the choice may be there, but we don't have to make that choice to do bad. We can, with practice and learning and with a good society, consistently choose good. I know many people are pessimistic about that these days, but keep your pessimism to yourself. The infinity of God says, don't be pessimistic.
There can be no good if there's no evil. Good is only good relative to something else.
Good is only good, at least as far as being morally praiseworthy, if you chose to do good. Right? If you accidentally saved somebody's life because you were checking your texts and you bumped into them and knocked them out of the way of a bus, you didn't heroically save them. I'm sure they're still happy that they're alive, but that wouldn't be called a good deed.
Everything is good, but nothing is good.
Exactly. There has to be a choice. Joe?
Right, I mean, that's the thing. Everybody's here brought 3 cans of food, but I only brought 1 can of food to feed the needy, and that happens again and again. You know, that there's still separation. It's all, you can't have the light without the darkness because there's nothing to compare it to.
Right. And that's why we continually invoke the idea of distinction between light and dark over and over again. And we give thanks for both light and dark, as we do every day. This very verse appears in our daily service right at the beginning, right after the Baruch Hu, the beginning of our Shachrit service in the morning, about 9:45 on Saturday mornings for those that would like to participate. I got to put the commercial in there somewhere, right? It's got to pay our sponsor. So there's a reason why this verse has captured part of our Siddur, because the principle is so important. And it's not just there to be read and turn the page. It's there to invoke everything that we have been discussing, to make sure that we are mindful of everything that we have gone over so far, so that all the pages on this book aren't just a load of words. Sorry, all the words on all these pages of this book are not just a load of words. There is no other creator of source of anything, and therefore we are as much a part of God's creation as the galaxies and the viruses. One relationship. We're down to our last one. Right? We said one by definition, we said one by character, we said one source, and one relationship. The people of the world may call God by many names. Many of them may worship in different ways. Some may even have twisted their path to God. Absolutely, Judaism recognizes first with idolatry, but even within our own ranks, that some people distort what God has tried to show to humanity and end up going down paths that are not desired. But ultimately, all of us, by virtue of being alive, all the threads of reality, we are headed the same way, whether we acknowledge it or not. Some of us may be backing towards it. Some of us may be zigzagging. Some of us may be resisting the pull. But ultimately, we all point to the same place. So, with that in mind, we're going to talk about how we're going to learn to apply all this. If you keep this one concept in mind, God is one, it will help you systematize everything else that we are going to do, all of the other principles on the page that you've been given. And by the way, notes from this discussion will be handed out at the end of the class. But we are going to do it a little bit more systematically for each of the other principles. Because rather than speaking only in generalities, we also want to explain how these principles get applied in 4 different facets of Judaism. We're going to look at liturgy. How is the principle of the night reflected in our prayers? We're going to look at history. How has the principle appeared in our past? How has it cropped up throughout our history and our long struggle with trying to do this? We're going to look at it in the frame of musar, or ethics, which is to say, how does this inspire us to act? And we're going to look at it within the relationship of time, meaning calendar and life cycles. How does this principle appear throughout different life cycle or calendar celebrations? 4 categories make sense? 4 cups of wine, 4 categories. Okay, so let's just do a quick summary for the main principle that we just had. Obviously, God is one, imbues everything else in Judaism, but let's just look at 4 very simple ways through these 4 facets that this applies more directly. So our history facet. Creation, right? That whole created of the universe thing, it's a kind of a big historical event. And although the scientific details are still being worked out, go researchers, the Torah has always held that everything in the universe came from a single source. That was not always a popular view. Most of the last 2,000 years, in fact, the idea that the universe had a beginning was considered stupid. That real science thought that the universe was infinite, not just in size, but infinite in time, and therefore had no beginning. Judaism said, no, the universe had a beginning point. We're still working out exactly on how we would date that. By the way, Judaism has no problem with the notion that the universe is 14 or 15 billion years old. But what those numbers represent and what our 5,775 represent, those are different things. But the idea that God is one and therefore the universe comes from that oneness, that there has never been an argument, debate, or discussion about. It may seem so obvious that you've never even considered it. Ethics, or musar, tzedakah. Think for a moment, and there are many reasons why we do tzedakah, but think for a moment about the impact of recognizing that God is one on the Jewish concept of tzedakah, and one of the ways it sets it apart from the notion of charity. The principled act of giving, not the caring act, but the principled act, is based on the belief that everything belongs to God. Right? The money in my wallet, well, in my bank account, because who carries cash, the money that I have belongs to God. Because God created it. How can I say it belongs to me? Now, yes, I will use it, and yes, I get to use it, but I only get to use it according to the rules of the one who created it. Right? If I loan you my car and I tell you don't go over 55, you better not go over 55 in my car. And you can't say, hey man, you can't boss me. I'll drive as fast as I want to drive. No, it's my car. You can drive as fast as you want to drive in your car. You can spend all the money you've made in the reality you created, how you want to spend it. Right? Go create your own universe, make your cash, and then you can spend it how you like. In this reality, right, if you live in my universe, says God, you play by my rules. And so tzedakah is God telling us, I am the source of all, I am the source of you, and I am the source of the person in need. I am the source of your cash, and I am telling you that you need to give some of that to that person over there. And I would like you to do it lovingly. I would like you to do it caringly. I'd like you to do it recognizing the justice of the situation. And I'm not going to ask you to do it in any way, shape, or form that is going to be destructive to you. But one way or another, you need to do this. And I have the right to tell you that. Liturgy. Just a short example, because we're going to talk about this a little bit more later in one of our later courses. But can anyone think of a Jewish prayer that maybe embodies this notion of God is one? Okay, so the Shema is the first prayer learned because all other prayers and deeds hang off its essential beliefs about God and our connection to God. Right? And the Shema will be covered in more detail in a future class. But I want to make sure that we understand that everything else hangs off of it, which is why we teach it first to our children. It is why it is one of the first prayers we say in the morning and one of the last things we say at night. It's not just because it's the Jewish catechism. It's because to understand the Shema in its totality means that you understand everything else we've discussed in its totality. And if you understand that, everything else falls into place. And the time, how does this get reflected? Every day. Right, this is a little bit of a cheat. We're going to be more specific in our time and calendar and life cycles in the future classes. But this one I just had to cheat and say there is no single holiday or life cycle event tied to God alone or God's oneness. Right, what's the holiday when we celebrate God being one? Yeah, all of them. Right? What's the life cycle event where we invoke God's oneness? All of them. Right? Everything is based on this. That's why it is the Keter. That's why it is the crown of Judaism. Because God's oneness and God's greatness, God's existence and God's infinitude, is the beginning for everything else and the primary organizing principle for every other piece of Jewish knowledge you have. We may divide it up into prayer and into time and into history and into ethics. We may divide it up into culture and food and art. We may divide it up into all sorts of different categories. But ultimately, everything in Judaism, just like that wonderful, come on, back up, sphere of life, replace all those little things around it rather than species names with different Jewish acts and the infinite things that we need to do each day. All of them draw back to that center line. They all draw back to the fact that God is one. And if you, I wish I could wipe it out here and hide it up there. If you wipe out that middle, and all you're left with is the peripheral tabs of Jewish life. You know, there's bagels, and over here is the Jewish wedding ceremony, and up there is the Torah, and over there is being honest in your business. If you just keep all those and wipe out that center, it will fall apart. And it won't work to do what it's supposed to do. Because all of those things on the outside are there to lead you to that center. And if you ignore the center, or if you never take the time to walk towards it, then you're just living life in the periphery. And that isn't what Judaism is meant to be. All right, let's see if I can skip back to where I was. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so next time, same bat time, same bat channel. We're going to be looking at the topic of Malchut. I took the liberty, Natan, of putting together a brief synopsis. Okay, but if you want to give more specifics, not today, okay. Malchut is defined as the sovereignty of God, which is an elusive idea in the modern world because we have such a poor view of monarchs. Right? It used to be when you said God is kingly, God is sovereign, people imagined the majesty of the court. They imagined the goodness of an honest and true king who would rule over you fairly and justly. And most of us nowadays, especially those of us in the United States who have a Revolutionary War narrative which is all about getting rid of the king, have trouble with this nonsense of kingship in the modern world. So we're going to have to go beyond that next week. Because Malchut, the reflection on God's sovereignty, asks us to accept God as the ultimate lawgiver, the ruler and protector, and inspires us to thank and petition God to provide us with a stable sense of purpose. And that may seem challenging, but I'm sure that we're up to it. And in particular, the topics that are going to be covered in next week's session are going to be the Aleinu on personal prayer, to go back, Stuart, more to your question about the Mishaberach and personal engagement, looking at the history of the kings of Israel, not so great, and specifically also looking at the wedding ceremony as reflecting this principle. Okay, so that's the formal end. Questions? Yeah.
Go back to talk that Torah being a metaphor. Where do you draw the line? It was creation a metaphor? Was Moses a metaphor? Where do you read that?
So one of the reasons why, when Rambam wrote his Guide to the Perplexed, which was one of the first explicit articulations of this notion, it's embedded within all of our tradition, within Mishnah, within Midrash, within the Talmud, and all the way back into the Torah itself. The idea that God is speaking poetically. God certainly says, I have no hands, and yet in the Torah itself, God says, has hands. But when Rambam explicitly wrote that vast sections of the Torah are speaking metaphorically, not literally, about God's essence, they burnt the book in parts of Europe. because of exactly your question of where do you draw the line. What Rambam believed, well, let me put it this way, what the European rabbis who burned his books believed was that if you tell people that some things are metaphor, they will take everything to be metaphor that they want to be metaphor. So keeping kosher, hey, that must be a metaphor, right? You know, having the Passover Seder, well, probably the Exodus was a metaphor, and I don't like matzah much. So I'll just learn the poetry, but I won't do the deed. They were very worried about that. But their answer then was to make everything literal. And Rambam believed that to be a worse answer than his. Rambam believed that, yes, it is difficult to understand the distinction between metaphor that is meant to inspire and actual deeds that we are meant to do. And that many people are tempted, for a whole variety of reasons, to mix those two categories of their own devising. But he also believed that to deny people the right to learn what God is by pointing out to them the metaphors that are contained within the Torah and what it means about God's essence, is to deny them that ultimate purpose, which is to draw closer to God. Because if you trap someone in literalism, then you've failed to let the Torah, you prevented the Torah from doing its job, which is to help us to acknowledge God is one. Remember our big stack of books, it's helping us acknowledge that we can live in harmony with the infinite greatness of God in an infinitely complex universe. Well, if I deny the infinity of God because I'm stuck with the Fisher-Price version of God, because that's safer for me, because it has nice round edges and I can't, hurt myself on it, then I'm going to miss out on the infinity of God. And Rambam and in my opinion, most of the great sages, both before and after him, felt it was better to err with caution and discretion and discussion on the side of helping people to understand that not everything is literal. Now, the argument of where that happens case by case is something we love to argue about in rabbinic school and in Jewish learning. So there are those who argue that creation is all metaphorical, but everything after the 7 days is literal. And there are those who love to say, no, everything from Noah back was metaphorical, but everything forward. Philo, who was a philosopher in the 1st century BCE in Alexandria, argued that everything of the patriarchs prior to Egypt was metaphor. So there has been a lot of controversy and discussion. But all of those who argue about where the metaphor is or isn't hold on to the essence of why it would be a metaphor or not, and what we are trying to learn and achieve spiritually through this. It's not simply, it's a metaphor, I don't have to listen to it. If it's a metaphor, I have to work harder. And that's a very important thing to hold on to. Right? It's just like poetry. I don't know if you were the same as me, but whenever we came to poems in our English class, before they had it called language arts, when I was back in English class, the poems took a lot longer to read for 5 sentences than reading an entire paragraph of Dickens, right? Because the poem forced me to work harder to understand what the poet wanted me to know. Dickens just spelled it out for me. But poetry, I had to put in a lot more effort. So when you say something is a metaphor, it is not dismissive of it. When you say something is a metaphor, it is demanding more of you, not less. More questions? Comments? I know we ran a little bit late because of our early cemetery meeting. We will not have a cemetery meeting each week. We will start on time at 7 o'clock every week. And I hope that everyone will be able to come to all of the sessions, but we are recording the audio. I can't guarantee how quickly this will go up. The audio will go up together with the slides for the different presentations, so that if you miss one, you should be able to still catch it. Like I said, I can't guarantee it'll come up within 24 hours, but we will get them up online soon. So hopefully everyone will be able to enjoy the entirety of all that we are trying to do here. And remember, you're not a kid, you're better. You can learn better now than you've ever learned in your life. So make the most of this opportunity.